Unity announced that they hired Jim Payne as their new chief product officer for advertising. So who the heck is Jim Payne? Jim Payne was previously the co-founder of MoPub, which is the world's largest in-app ad server and exchange, according to the press release. You might have heard of them, Warren. They were sold to Twitter at some point and then eventually spun off and sold to AppLovin. Now, that's a pretty impressive pedigree, but what if I told you he was also the co-founder for Max Ads, the mobile bidder system, which was also sold to AppLovin? Now this gets kind of interesting. Unity, the games engine and growth marketing company that I'm obsessed with and nobody else cares about, had their earnings report, and it went okay. So Unity made $450 million in top-line revenue in Q2, slightly down from $460 million in Q1 of last year, but that's outperformed the guidance and expectations of analysts. They've drastically reduced their losses from Q1 to Q2, down to $126 million in Q2 from $291 million in Q1. Now that sounds like an incredible amount of improvement, doesn't it, Warren? Well, what if I told you all those costs were related to restructuring fees in Q1? Basically, we moved sideways, but it looks pretty nice as a top-line percentage. Bleeding has stopped, momentum hasn't shifted. Okay, that's all great. What's something interesting that's happening? As part of their earnings call last week, Unity announced that they hired Jim Payne as their new chief product officer for advertising. So who the heck is Jim Payne? Jim Payne was previously the co-founder of MoPub, which is the world's largest in-app ad server and exchange, according to the press release. You might have heard of them, Warren. They were sold to Twitter at some point and then eventually spun off and sold to AppLovin. Now, that's a pretty impressive pedigree, but what if I told you he was also the co-founder for Max Ads, the mobile bidder system, which was also sold to AppLovin? Now this gets kind of interesting.
Talk me through this journey. I'm trying to understand this snaking trail of how these companies intertwine, bought and sold to each other, and how we got to this current landscape. Give me a little more backstory here.
Okay, well, I'll first say that, I'm not an expert in this, but this is my understanding of what's happened. So MoPub was sold to Twitter, and while it was at Twitter, it was sort of like a really heavily underutilized asset. It had this huge install base of SDK installs to serve ads against, but it wasn't being super heavily monetized by Twitter. AppLovin, as they have done multiple times, saw this as a hugely important asset, paid Twitter a pretty modest fee for it relative to the value, and so they integrated it into their platform. They basically bribed all the advertisers to kill the MoPub SDK and install the Max Ad SDK instead, and they amalgamated that all into being a massive distribution platform now for digital advertising. So we've talked a lot about how AppLovin has been really crushing it for a really long time. They're scary to interact with. Their stock price has been going way up. They're good at what they do. And having the guy who's at least a part player in that whole strategy and the technology behind that seems like a really important person to have at the head of the advertising product for Unity. So still a lot to figure out at Unity. They basically said, give us 6 months. We're getting the right people in place. Give us 6 months. We're going to figure it out. But it seems like at least this hire was a pretty good one. And they've also been hiring several other new executives, and a few people have left. So it's a lot of churn, but is there a path forward? Maybe.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it seems like a smart hire, at least on paper. I mean, the thing with Unity, we talk about this all the time, and we obviously do a lot of business with Unity. We have friends there, so all disclaimers in place. We always talk about how Unity is pretty powerfully positioned with all the sort of different parts of the ecosystem that they own, either through what they built or what their acquisitions like ironSource. But what seems highly unoptimized still today is just sort of the synergies between those ecosystems, or even I think only very recently for those of us that work in the user acquisition space could you just make one contract and do business with both ironSource and Unity, even though they've now been the same company and selling essentially the same product for a while now, 18 months or so since the acquisition. I have no sense of time, about a year. But yeah, even though they're it's the same people working on the accounts, it's the same business, you needed two completely separate contracts, and you're buying the same product at the end of the day, like a rewarded video placement in network of apps. So it does seem like they need more cohesive leadership kind of pulling those pieces together. Jim Payne seems like I don't know Jim, never met him. I have no idea how good he is at his job, but on paper, he seems like a good person that's kind of been through a process of this, of kind of merging these different components into a cohesive business unit. I mean, AppLovin, to their credit, they've done a great job of rolling these individual things up that they buy and then making a sum that is greater than the parts. So it makes sense. I think Unity has very good clay, as they say, and having someone who can come in and tie the room together a bit more, I think is really what they need right now.
In the context of sort of the ongoing narrative around game development, game engines, Unity is obviously the market leader. They have about 70% of mobile games built on the Unity platform. Last week, we talked a bit about how Second Dinner had invested in W4 Games, which is a game studio which focuses on development of the Godot platform, which is a new open source competitor to Unity. And Unreal. And we talked about how it's pretty interesting that these guys are trying to basically distance themselves from the traditional behemoth and make a new track with this new game engine. The interesting flip side of it is there is such a huge opportunity for Unity here because they have this multiple sides of the business, right? They have the growth platform, which spins off a ton of cash, and then they have the engine, which is basically an investment platform that they can use it's like a giant lead generation funnel. And so the reason I'm so bullish on Unity in theory over time is that these are such complementary pieces of the business. Anyone who uses a Unity game engine is a natural customer and an easy sales pipeline to the Grow engine. And conversely, you can subsidize the production of the engine using the cash flow from the Grow business. So long term, it's like Godot is never going to have that differentiation, right? There's never going to be a go-to-market strategy around Godot where they can help you do your marketing. And so it's like I said last week, I love the idea. I love that Second Dinner's taking a big bet. It's great on paper, but it's really, really hard to compete with a company that has all these synergistic ways of improving their business overall. So we'll see what happens in the long term.
Yeah, hope y'all enjoyed this balanced diet of Uptick news content for the week. Anyway, here at Uptick, we're big gaming nerds. We live and breathe games. We love scaling games. That's what we do when we're not making podcasts, which is 99% of our time. So if you are making a great game across any technology and want good people to help you with user acquisition, creative, and the analytics, resourcing, and software behind that, reach us through our website. It's uptick.com, upptic.com.
Talk soon.